teen mental health crisis. Since 2010 and 2012, rates of teen anxiety, depression, self-harm, psych hospitalization, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide rates are all up significantly. Anxiety is up roughly 150%, depression 130%, self-harm and psych hospitalization rates up roughly 200%. Suicide rates for boys are up 91%, 165% for girls. And overall, ratings of significant declines in happiness and life satisfaction and increases in loneliness and unhappiness. There's a survey that questions teens as well about, do you think your life, your future will be better or worse than your parents? And the rates are staggering, where teens are saying, I think mine's going to be worse. I don't think it's going to be the same, and I don't think it's going to be better. Yet, on the other hand, this is the most diagnosed, treated, and medicated generation in the history of the world. So what is going on? From 60 to 1990, the rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide were relatively low, and they were very stable. The important part is that they were very stable. Use of psych meds and clinic visits increased in 1991. That's mostly due to the fact that SSRIs were approved in like 87. I think Prozac was the first one, and it took a while for that to get out into the community. But once that was out into the community, that increased clinic visits and people getting medications. And the rates for suicide, depression, and anxiety actually dropped from 1991 to 2011. So rates for 30 years for teen mental health were stable and low. Then they dropped for 20 years, and then they started to rise drastically in 2012. So this coincides with smartphones and social media. This is just a quick slide of what transpired. Smartphones were introduced in 2007. Radio, I don't know if you know this, but when radio first came out, there was a lot of talks that it was going to harm society and there was going to be cultural effects as well. What I found interesting in my research was the idea that if you go back in time, for those of us that are older, personal computers in the 80s, internet in the 90s, Friendster and MySpace, 2002 and 2003, LinkedIn and Facebook, goes all the way back to 2003 and 2004, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Of significance was Facebook purchased Instagram in 2012, and it went from 10 million to 100 million users in a matter of months. So that's a significant thing to see that Facebook, there are tech companies that have figured out how to grow their base, how to keep people on their platforms, and how to really, really engage with people. In 2010, 80% of US homes had a home computer and internet. And teens reported spending an hour a day on social media. So think about it. There was social media around. Now, yes, we don't have, that's a very small sample to see any mental health effects. But people were on home computers and on social media. But what's the difference? Where were people on social media? They were on their home computers. How many home computers did families typically have? They had one. Where was it at? It was typically in the kitchen, the family room, the dining room. It was a central location. So that's key to seeing suddenly this drastic rise and the effects of engagement on these platforms. In 2011, 77% of US teens had flip phones and 23% had smartphones. So people were texting, people were taking pictures, people were calling each other. So when people say it's just the phone or it's just this, you can see, people were able to contact each other vis-a-vis texting and stuff like that. If we look at the progression of then utilization, 2012, 55% of teens owned smartphones. 2014, 80% of teens owned smartphones. by 18, 95% of US teens own or have access to a smartphone. By 2013, teens report spending 2 hours a day on social media. By 2015, they're spending 4 hours a day. And by 2023, US teens are spending 7.5 hours per day. And 8 to 12-year-olds are spending 5 hours per day on non-school screen media. Now, notice I did cite this because I didn't want you to think I was being alarmist or I came up with these stats. This is the American College of Pediatricians. That's their reporting. So you can see, think about that for just a second. If my teen is spending 7.5 hours on average, so that means some are spending far more, some are spending a little less. That's a full-time job. They're spending 40 to 50 hours a week on a phone, plus being a full-time student, right? And 8 to 12-year-olds, who would have suspected that it was 5 hours a day? I wouldn't have. So again, I'm not an alarmist, but this is alarming. So let's look at, so what? So what are the effects? Well, research demonstrates, correlational and causal links. And it doesn't take much of a stretch of your imagination to think about them in 5 major areas. Social displacement or deprivation. Another way of looking at this, and some researchers call this time displacement. And think about it. If you're spending 7 hours a day on your phone, what are you not doing for 7 hours a day? You're not interacting, you're not socializing, you're not face-to-face interacting. Mm-hmm. You're not engaged. So we have social displacement and deprivation, or social deprivation effects. Some researchers call it different things. Heavy use, not simple usage, is what displaces IRL, or in real life interactions. So there was a slow decline in the 1990s from a play-based childhood to an electronics-based or phone-based childhood. And we're going to talk about that more in the parenting section. But again, there was a precipitous drop in interactions, real life interactions, spending time with my friends, hanging out, doing things, going to the movies, going into a club, interacting with people in real life in 2012. And then that was made even worse, obviously, in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Sleep effects. Long established science that teens need more sleep than adults. 9 hours on average, typical rule of thumb, adults need 8, kids need 9. In 91, roughly 30% of teens got less than 7 hours of sleep. And by 2023, it's 70%. So it's the majority of kids are not getting enough sleep. Well, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is and as Elizabeth said, you guys have already had a whole workshop on this, so you could probably tell me, but there's blue light effects. Now, I'm not a physician, but we know blue light effects tend to interfere with melatonin. So you get off, it becomes a hormonal imbalance, and that impacts the ability to sleep. And there are causal links between heavy media usage and shorter sleep duration, greater sleep latency. So you're sleeping shorter amount of time. It takes you longer to fall asleep, and then you wake up more when you're doing that. And then there's poor performance on focused attention tasks and slower reaction times. So again, it's not that we just think it affects you. We know that it affects you. Attention fragmentation, excessive phone usage, constant notification. I mean, if you're on your phone for 7 or 8 hours, less teacher focus, we know that that's clearly established. Less concentration, worse performance, and lower productivity. So in 2023, when asked, obviously there's hundreds of different apps for phones, but when you ask teens rate consistently between 13 and 15 as the most popular ones. It shifts and it changes, but that's on average. So the average teen has 8 at least 8 of the 13 social apps on their phone and gets 192 alerts a day. So you can imagine that constant interruption, that constant inability to attend and focus for any length of time. You know, learning theory is all about time on task. So if you interfere with time on task, you're directly interfering with a teen's ability to learn and retain and recall information. Cyberbullying, the anonymity, or what's called the online disinhibition effect, where people online feel like I can say whatever I want. I can be a little more mean than I would in real life. I can challenge people. I can call people out. I can do things that I wouldn't do in real life. But because of there's less inhibition, people do it online. And the constant usage equals the constant exposure. So what's very interesting is bullying in real life. If I say to you bully, does that typically conjure a schoolyard bully? Does that conjure up a boy or a girl? Typically.
Boy.
A boy, right? So what we know is that in real life bullying is way drastically down. If I say to you cyberbully, do you think of a boy or a girl?
Girl.
It is a girl. It's almost exclusively a girl phenomenon. So for the reasons that we'll talk about the gender effects, but so cyberbullying is very, very high. In 2020, teens reported like 25%, 1 in 4. Now it's half. And people think that that's probably underrated, and but so anyway, so bullying has moved online, and it's typically a girl phenomenon. And then what we call contagion effects. Contagion effects is a concept in psychology where if a bunch of anxious people get together and talk about their anxiety and how anxious they are, do they tend to get more anxious or less anxious?
More.
Same with depression. Same with, you know, if you go to a leadership group and everybody talks about being a leader and everything, then everybody tends to subscribe more to leadership. So it's positive and negative, right? It's a support group, right? So what happens is human beings are very susceptible to contagion effects. You can go back to, let's see, War of the Worlds. If you remember that situation, Orson Welles. I mean, people thought it was real. So as more people thought it was real, more people thought it was real, right? So that's how we influence each other. And so if you look at then social media algorithms and how they work, now that's not my forte. That's not what I do. But people do tell you that if I start out looking at mental health, so what's my feed full of?
Just mental health.
And then if I watch that longer, it's tracking that. Then what's my feed full of more?
More mental health.
More mental health, and then more mental health, and then more mental health, and then more mental health. And then very, very quickly, we get to these extremes, right? So people that are already susceptible to contagion effects are spending more and more and more and more time in these negative spaces, right? There's perceived popularity. So the people in these groups, who are the most popular person in the mental health group? It tends to be the people that have the most psychopathology, right? Or who share the most, or who are the most vulnerable, right? That facilitates then we're going to share more. And what are we going to share? Our positives, our good, our this? No, we're going to do the other way. So the popularity then becomes how much psychopathology do you have, which is the opposite of what we know with the resiliency literature. With the resiliency literature, when we look at people who are really, really resilient, who've overcome, you know, real true traumas, you know, they don't tend to do that at all. They tend to do the opposite of it. They tend to really try to pay attention to where they pay attention. So if we look at teen ER visits for self-harm. Again, they were low and stable in the 90s, and then they've increased a great deal. Well, that also coincides with hashtag self-harm, hashtag cutting, hashtag mental health, all these different TikToks, right? Which get billions of views. So when I was trained, I was never trained I was trained in the late 80s, early 90s. We never discussed cutting at all. I'd probably been in practice 10 years before I ever had my first kid who was cutting. And I was like, what is that? So I had to do a quick little amount of research. And now it is so predominant. So clearly something has happened in the culture to drive that. And then addiction. We'll talk more about addiction probably in the parenting part and the withdrawal effects. Okay.
And before we move on, we did have a good question. We've got two actually. One is just, can we share the PowerPoint presentation after we're done? The notes or the slides, I'll be happy to. I would have done it before, but there was still so much kind of fine tuning and, ooh, that's really good kind of that we were doing up until the last minute that I didn't do it before then. But someone else brought up a good point that I don't know if you have a comment on. And I appreciate this. And guys, when you ask questions and engage, it makes it more interesting for both of us, and it allows, Scott to go, yeah, let's talk about that. So this person said, and by the way, I never use your names, whether you go anonymous or not, I'll never use your names. Children are spending a lot of time on screens in schools now, between Google Classroom and the smartboard viewing, which seems to be adding to the screen addiction problem. Is that anything you have some stats on of how much time in school that children are using on screens? And do you have any thoughts on that?
So that's an excellent question. And by the way, let me just say, I've never ever done this type of presentation where I don't see the audience either. So if I'm coming off as stilted, or if I'm just reading the thing, it's because I'm trying to use them as prompts and then riff off on it. But I'm used to looking at people and then judging the feedback and stuff. And I didn't realize that until we started this. So I'm learning this too. So I apologize. So please ask the questions, because we can go wherever. I want to go where the audience wants us to go. So I think, yes, clearly, if we clump all screen usage together, yes, screen bad. But that's not the reality. What it is, and we're going to talk more about this, and this is really an important takeaway. It's a curvy linear relationship between mental health of teens and adults, by the way, and tech utilization. So none tends to not be associated with very good mental health, and too much is associated with not very good mental health. So the issue is the sweet spot, right? The sweet spot. And we'll talk, and Elizabeth and I have talked a lot about this in other contexts, and we're going to try to get it into this today, the issue of 2D versus 3D, right? So think about it. If your kid is using their screen in class as a tool, that's probably the best utilization of it, because it is a tool, right? It has made us way more productive, way more efficient. We have access to information, right? So those are all the good things. The problem is we're spending too much time on it. And we're thinking that that's like socializing, that's interacting, and that's human contact. So I would say, I don't know the stats, because really the best the best experts in this field, they track that, but what we're really trying to track is non-school related screen activities outside of that, if that makes sense.